The Pontiac Silverdome was completed in 1975 at a cost of approximately $55.7 million, funded entirely by public bonds issued by the city of Pontiac, Michigan. It seated 80,000 people. It housed the Detroit Lions of the National Football League for 30 years. It hosted a Super Bowl. It hosted multiple NCAA basketball tournament events. It hosted the 1994 FIFA World Cup, becoming the first indoor venue in World Cup history to host matches. In 2009, it was sold at auction for $583,000. The buyer demolished it in 2017. The gap between $55.7 million and $583,000 is not the product of physical deterioration alone, though the building's condition had declined significantly in the 8 years between the Lions' departure in 2002 and the 2009 auction. It is the product of a specific combination of factors that this channel has not previously documented in its examination of athletic facilities: the complete evaporation of reuse value for a structure built to serve a single tenant who had already left, in a market that had lost the economic capacity to support any alternative use for an 80,000-seat dome stadium on the suburban periphery of one of the most economically distressed metropolitan areas in the United States. The forensic entry point for this case is the relationship between purpose-built infrastructure and residual value. Because the Silverdome documents the proposition that a building designed to serve a specific institutional tenant at a specific scale of civic ambition attains essentially no value the moment that tenant departs, and no equivalent institutional tenant exists to replace them. The $55.7 million that the city of Pontiac borrowed to build the Silverdome was not an investment in the conventional sense. It was a subsidy for the Detroit Lions' continued presence in the metropolitan area, expressed in concrete and steel and air-supported fabric roof. When the Lions left, the subsidy had been consumed. What remained was the structure. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The Detroit Lions' departure from the Pontiac Silverdome to the newly constructed Ford Field in downtown Detroit in 2002 was the specific event that initiated the terminal decline of a building that had been designed with no viable use case other than as the home of a professional sports franchise. The city of Pontiac had financed the Silverdome on the assumption, explicit in the public bond documents and in the political rationale for the investment, that the Detroit Lions would remain as the primary tenant for a sufficient period to justify the $55.7 million in public capital the construction required. The NFL franchise had no legal obligation to remain. The lease agreement between the Detroit Lions and the city of Pontiac did not contain a provision that would have required the franchise to compensate the city for the full amortized value of the public investment if the franchise chose to relocate to a new facility. That absence was not unusual. It reflected the standard terms of professional sports facility agreements of the 1970s, which had been negotiated in an environment where municipal governments competed aggressively for professional sports franchises, and where the bargaining power asymmetry between franchise owners and municipal governments consistently produced lease terms more favorable to the franchise than to the public entity that had funded the facility. The covenant that the city of Pontiac did not negotiate was the one that would have required the Detroit Lions to remain for a term sufficient to allow the city to retire the public debt the construction had required, or to compensate the city if the franchise departed before that term expired. The Ford Field subsidy that drew the Lions downtown was itself a public investment of approximately $115 million, drawn from Wayne County and City of Detroit resources, that the Lions' ownership negotiated on terms that gave the franchise a new facility without requiring the city and county to recover the stranded value of the Silverdome asset they were leaving behind. Two public investments in two facilities for the same franchise, in the same metropolitan area, within 30 years, producing one abandoned stadium and one occupied one. At what point does a city's willingness to subsidize a sports franchise's facility become an act of institutional negligence toward its own financial interests? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that governed the city of Pontiac's 2009 sale of the Silverdome produced a result that the auction confirmed was accurate. The building was worth approximately $583,000 to the only category of buyer willing to acquire it. That category was not a sports franchise, because no sports franchise needed an 80,000-seat dome stadium in Pontiac, Michigan. It was not a concert promoter or event operator, because the economics of touring entertainment in the metropolitan Detroit market did not support the operational costs of maintaining and staffing an 80,000-seat venue between events. It was not a real estate developer, because the 38-acre suburban site offered no development opportunity that could be realized while the stadium structure remained on it, and limited opportunities even after demolition. The buyer, who paid $583,000, was a Canadian investment group that acquired the property on the thesis that the land had some residual value and that a buyer for the structure or for a redevelopment of the site might eventually materialize. That thesis proved incorrect. The investment group's attempts to find a viable reuse for the Silverdome over the following years produced a series of announced development concepts, each of which failed to advance to the stage of committed capital and construction. The building deteriorated progressively during those years, as the lack of operational revenue made maintenance investment economically unjustifiable. The fabric roof collapsed under snow load in 2013, an event that both documented the building's physical deterioration and eliminated one of the few remaining arguments for its preservation as a usable structure. The appraisal failure in this case was not an error in the 2009 auction process, which correctly identified the market value of a stranded asset with no viable institutional tenant. The appraisal failure occurred in 1975, when the city of Pontiac valued the Silverdome as an asset whose ongoing utility would justify the $55.7 million in public investment, without adequately pricing the risk that the tenant whose presence justified the investment would eventually depart without compensating the city for the stranded value that departure would produce. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The Silverdome's 8 years of vacancy between 2002 and 2009 produced a deterioration cycle that documented, with unusual precision, what happens to a purpose-built, large-scale public infrastructure when the maintenance investment required to preserve its physical condition cannot be justified by any revenue the facility is capable of generating. The city of Pontiac's annual maintenance cost for the vacant Silverdome was estimated at between $1.5 million and $2 million, a figure that exceeded the revenue the facility could generate from the occasional events that its depleted physical condition made possible. The city continued paying those costs for 7 years after the Lions departed, in the absence of a viable sale or redevelopment option and in the belief, sustained longer than the financial position warranted, that a buyer or tenant would eventually emerge who would justify the continued maintenance investment. That belief was the institutional denial of this case, not the denial of a financial reality that the city refused to acknowledge, but the denial that the category of buyer or tenant required to give the Silverdome a viable future might simply not exist in the market that Pontiac and metropolitan Detroit represented in the early 2000s. The economic context of the denial is important. The city of Pontiac was itself in severe financial distress during the years of the Silverdome vacancy, a distress that was part of the broader deindustrialization of the Michigan manufacturing economy and the collapse of the automotive sector that the 2008 financial crisis accelerated. A city in financial distress does not have the administrative capacity, the political capital, or the access to capital markets that a creative redevelopment of a stranded stadium asset would require. The denial in this case was therefore not purely a failure of institutional judgment. It was partly a failure of institutional capacity. A city that lacked the resources to pursue the redevelopment scenarios that might have produced a better outcome was maintaining an asset that continued consuming the resources it did not have. Because the alternative of immediate sale at a loss that made the original investment's failure explicit was politically more difficult than continued maintenance of a building that was visibly deteriorating toward its own resolution. The Silverdome was demolished in December 2017, 10 years after the city of Pontiac sold it for $583,000 and 15 years after the Detroit Lions departed for Ford Field. The demolition itself was initially botched. The first implosion attempt on December 3, 2017 failed to bring down the structure, as the explosive charges did not fully execute the planned sequence and the building remained standing, in damaged but partially intact condition, following what had been promoted as a public spectacle of controlled demolition. The structure was eventually brought down through additional demolition work in the days following the failed implosion. The site was subsequently cleared and has been marketed for redevelopment as industrial and distribution space, a use case whose economics are supported by the suburban Detroit location's access to the regional highway network rather than by any characteristic of the former stadium site itself. What the Silverdome case reveals in the context of this channel's 30-case archive is the specific category of public infrastructure stranding that purpose-built sports facilities represent. Every other case file in this archive has documented a building whose stranding was produced by a financial failure of the ownership, an over-leveraged acquisition, a covenant default, a market contraction that eliminated the revenue required to service the debt. The Silverdome documents a different mechanism, a public investment in infrastructure that was never designed to have value independent of the institutional tenant it was built to serve, whose value evaporated completely when that tenant departed, and whose demolition sale price was approximately 1% of its original construction cost. The lesson is not that cities should not build sports facilities. It is that cities that build sports facilities for private franchises without adequate lease protections are making a gift, not an investment, and the gift's value is fully realized by the franchise at the moment of occupancy, not at any later point in the facility's physical existence. The Lions played at Ford Field for 20 years after the Silverdome was demolished. The city of Pontiac is no longer the home of any professional sports franchise. If this case file changed how you evaluate the public finance of professional sports infrastructure, subscribe to this channel, because the next case examines a stadium whose public subsidy was designed to prevent exactly this outcome, and which produced it anyway. And in the comments, given the absence of lease provisions requiring the Detroit Lions to compensate Pontiac for the stranded value of the Silverdome, what specific lease covenant would have most effectively protected the city's $55.7 million public investment? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.